So in the previous video, when we called this update message function, we haven't checked the value of the message, right? Like we have just called this and showcase this particular transaction being made, and it consumed some gas. And here you can see the decoded input is hello Chainlink. So when we just check this message variable value again by clicking on it, then we can see the updated value, which is hello Chainlink. And you can also see the same by clicking on this decoded output as hello Chainlink. So like whatever we pass over here, hello Chainlink 123, so we will see the same over here. So what we are doing, we are just updating this state variable called message in this update message function. And one thing that I forgot to mention, so why we were seeing this orange button in the deploy, because it also changes the state by deploying this contract onto the blockchain. So it's basically writing this entire contract on chain. That's why it's also a transaction, like the transaction button, which is doing a transaction, and it just call this constructor and then assign the initial message to the message. So it does two things. So first it writes this entire contract on chain, and then also it stores the initial message parameter value to the storage variable message when we click on this transact button, and that's why it creates a new contract instance whenever we click on this transact button by deploying a contract. So you might be wondering like why we are seeing this public over here, like the green colored text as public. So that's a visibility modifier. So when we go back to our original Chainlink documentation, and we have seen like the naming a contract, and then you will see this section called variables. So you can see like JavaScript contracts can have state variables and local variables. So we have gone through this already, state variables and local variables. State variables are variables with values that are permanently stored in contract storage, whereas the local variables are present only until the function execution. So there are different types of variables: string, like unsigned integer of 256 bits, etc. So you can also check the Solidity documentation to learn about all the different variables, like the types. And I think I've already shown via this particular Solidity by example tutorial, like the primitive data types that are there, and then like address u into 56 into 56, etc. So like as you move further in your smart contract development journey, you will use more of these types, and then you will get to learn about each and every type, and also like the various ranges that you are seeing over here, like u in 32, u into 56. So you will use everything like in your entire journey, and you will also come across a lot of these different types of like the data types. So now, like I was telling about this public that you are seeing over here. So these are called as visibility modifiers. So like the public, internal, or private. So I think it's similar to what we see in Java as well, like the public function, private function, and I think there was also protected in Java, private, public, and protected functions. But in this case, there are public, private, and internal. So like it's not functions in this case, like we are defining these visibility to our variables. Like we will also do the same to the functions, but we will see that, we'll come to that later. So you can see visibility modifiers are used to define the levels of access to these variables. Here are some examples of state variables with different visibility modifiers that we are seeing over here. So string public message, you have already seen similar thing over here. So it means that this particular variable is public, and then you will come across this internal, which means that like the scope, like the visibility of that particular variable is only internal to the contract. So if you define something like, if you make it as internal, then only you can access that inside this contact. So it will still work fine because we are accessing it inside the contact, but you cannot access like outside, like the way we are accessing this message variable previously. So like when you deploy the new instance of the contact, I think I haven't compiled it, sorry. So when you compile it again, and let me just type hello, then you won't see this message blue button because you have defined it as internal, but still you can use the same inside the contract. And you can also, like when you define another contract, then you can also inherit this particular internal variable. And there is another type called private. So the private one you can't even inherit. So when you define it as private, so you can still access inside the contract, but you can't inherit it. So when you inherit it in another contract, so like when we come to inheritance, then we will see this. So when we inherit this contract by another contract, then we can't access this particular private variable. We can only access it from this contract, and we won't be seeing outside the contract as well. So that's the difference between private, internal, and public. So by default initially we were using it as public. So if you don't define anything, by default it's internal, like it's neither public nor private, it's internal, as you can see over here also, string internal message. So like when we leave it, then it will show the internal visibility over here, but initially we have defined it as public. So the next thing that we will see is the same visibility modifiers for the functions. As like you can see, learn more about state variables visibility over here. So we can just click on this link, then we will be redirected to this particular official Solidity documentation. Then we can read about this public state variables different from internal ones. Compiler automatically generates the getter functions, as we are seeing. So like the way we are accessing this from here, so it basically, the compiler has generated the getter function for this particular public function, using which we are reading this variable. And when used within the same contract, the external access invokes the getter, while internal access gets the variable value directly from storage. So like we'll come to this later, like when you use this keyword. I think this keyword was also there in Java. So this keyword is basically to, like when we externally access that particular variable, then we use it as using this keyword. So we will come to that later. Like it's like when you get more experience like developing the smart contracts, then you will understand everything. But for now we can just skip this part and come to this internal state variables can only be accessed. So as of now you can just understand like the public variables can be accessed anywhere outside the contract as well as by the inherited contracts. So internal state variables can only be accessed from within the contract and also in the derived contracts, like the contract which is inheriting the contract, and they cannot be accessed externally, and it's the default visibility level. And private state variables are similar to the internal ones, but they are not visible in the derived contracts. So now we will see this function's visibility.